So there is this person called Ranji. Now, Ranji was a world famous cricketer. In fact, he was the original international cricket celebrity, the first person ever to cross that barrier between sportsman and celebrity. But Ranji was so much more than that. He was also a prince of a state called Navanagar in India. And Ranji truly has had a magnificent life. I mean, the more I've read up about it, the more fascinated and excited I am. Hi, my name is Misha and welcome to Tarihi Tales. So when I say that Ranji has had a truly magnificent life and exciting life, I'm talking about the fact that he was born the son of a farmer. He became a prince at the age of 7. Everything was taken away from him pretty soon, and then he went on to England and somehow became the first ever international cricket celebrity. I mean, people were crazy about him. And exactly how all of this went down is quite juicy in its details, and I've given you all of them in my previous videos, which I'll link up here. This is the playlist. You can go check out the videos. But in this video, I'm gonna pick the story up from when Ranji has finally gotten back his throne back home in India in Navanagar, and that was the year 1907. But when Ranji gets the throne, the state is pretty much in shambles. The financial situation is bleak, to say the least, and even the administration is kind of falling apart. So much so that when they performed Ranji's crowning ceremony, all the decorations and the money for arranging just that ceremony itself had to be borrowed from neighboring states. And that is the point at which Ranji became the ruler of the state of Navanagar. Now, let me give you a rundown of what the numbers of the state actually look like, so you have like a better picture in mind. He inherited a land that was almost 3,791 square miles. If you read English historians, they say it's roughly the size of 3 English counties. Great measure, must say. So it's definitely not the largest state in India. It's a relatively small state. The population of the area was around 350,000, and this population was distributed among 400 different villages, and also the capital called Jamnagar. The revenue that came in from all of this was about 21 lakh rupees, which is a lot considering the times, but not nearly enough to run a state. An Englishman called J.A. Spender, who worked for the Westminster Gazette, actually visited this area of Navanagar and Jamnagar, and he gives a really nice account of the description of the type of land that this was. And at the end, he ends up calling this land a thirsty land. And a lot of historians agree that this was an apt description because the land of Navanagar was arid and dry with no irrigation and little to no rainfall. On top of this, one of the major issues that needed sorting out within the state was the capital itself. Now, as I mentioned, the capital is called Jamnagar, and it was a heavily congested city. The streets were narrow and winding, there was little air or space, there was poor sanitation, bad sewage systems, and because of all of this, the city was actually rampant with disease and life-threatening diseases like typhoid and cholera. In fact, the previous ruler of Navanagar, Jasaji, had actually died from typhoid itself because, back then it couldn't be treated as easily. And then naturally, like most states that are close to the point of drowning, another issue that Navanagar had was corruption. So historians say that Vibhaji, the foster father of Ranji, is because of Vibhaji that Ranji actually inherits the state of Navanagar. So Vibhaji, when he was the ruler, he was a very extravagant ruler and he would give out money here and there. And some of those practices that he had initiated were being carried out till this day. In fact, huge amounts of money were being given to eunuchs and some dancing girls who were descendants of famous courtesans that were favored by Vibhaji, and somehow a yearly trust was kind of set up where they would be getting money just because.
Eunuchs.
Okay, so these were some of the initial problems that Ranji was immediately handed over when he was given the throne of Navanagar. Now, we have to remember that Ranji himself was actually highly educated. He had gotten his preliminary education from the Rajkumar College in Rajkot, and he studied among other princes and future Maharajas, and then he went on to Cambridge and studied in the Trinity College in England. On top of all of this, Ranji was also very well traveled, so he had gained experience and seen places and had visions that rulers before him like Jasaji could have never had. So when Ranji came into power, he actually had a plan. He had a vision for what he wanted Jamnagar and Navanagar to look like. The first thing he does when he gets into office is that he takes expenditure under control. He wanted to eliminate any expenditure that was unnecessary, and he began by working on the eunuchs because they had by now been allotted huge areas of land and were also given a lot of money. And the only thing they did in return for the state was that when there were state organized functions or events, the eunuchs would be called in to kind of keep away evil spirits. So Ranji was decided that okay, for that we don't need to give them this much land for nothing. So he took back majority of those lands. This move was actually viewed as a very bold and courageous move because it was a little controversial as well. Now secondly, Ranji moved in to cater the dancing girls who were now being given yearly pensions just because they were the daughters of courtesans that Vibaji or some previous rulers favored. So he decided to put an end to that because the state could simply not afford to give out pensions just because they liked somebody. Then he went on and bought out the lands of a man called Khawas of Amran. He bought out these lands specifically because this guy had been a pain for Ranji from the moment that he had stepped onto the throne because he was constantly opposed to him and would constantly harass him with all his policies. So Ranji decided to just buy out all the land that he had and sent him away. Now, these were some of the smaller issues. Ranji actually had much bigger plans. In fact, one of his plans was to rebuild the city of Jamnagar to make it more airy and make it more sanitary. This would control the spread of diseases that was rampant in the city. Another disease that was actually quite common was rabies because of the amount of stray dogs that had gathered up in Jamnagar. So he was determined to kind of get all of this under control. He also had huge plans for the extension of the railway system into Navanagar, for the development of a port, and also for an irrigation system because he knew that the land was dry and depended heavily on rainfall, which most often than not chose not to come. Ranji had only basically made these plans and set them in motion. And by the time everything was just starting, Ranji fell ill. He himself contracted typhoid and he got so ill that people at many times thought that he's done for, this is it. But turns out he was much more resilient than people thought he would be. And as soon as he got better, he got back to his capital and he started working again. And this time he started work on the sewage system because he himself had gotten sick and he realized how bad the diseases are. And at the same time, he also started projects which would dig out wells in as many villages as possible in Navanagar so that people could have access to water. It's very interesting to see this shift in personality and planning, considering that this guy for the majority of his life has lived his life like an extravagant prince/superstar cricketer. But now he's an administrator and he's actually doing quite well. But nobody's perfect. And Ranji does make some mistakes. And I'll come to those mistakes a little later. So what happens was that now that he'd gotten back and was working on these sewage systems and wells and everything, he wasn't completely better. Like he wasn't 100%. So because he'd pushed himself, he fell ill once more. And this time his doctors, who were Britishers, they recommended to him that you need to get out of India and go somewhere that has clean air and everything. And he decided to go to England for a bit with his family. Now, Ranji stayed in England for a year and a month. He played cricket, he met up with his old friends, but right before he left England, he actually gave a speech. And in that speech, he spoke very plainly and called out the British Empire for being racist. People are still kind of confused as to why Ranji went on to make such bold statements because in the past he had shied away from all of this. Some people speculate that this might have been in reaction to the anti-Indian legislation and the arrest of Gandhi at this point, which was also going on in the background because by this point, the movements for the nation states of Pakistan, India, all of those had started. But We don't know why Ranji had such a change of heart, but something had definitely disturbed him on this trip. So Ranji, now completely healthy, had gotten back to Jamnagar and had started working on the project of rebuilding the capital. People say that he actually did this very smartly. He did it street by street and in a very tactful way that the least amount of people are disturbed and the most effective work is done. At the same time, he also started chasing out bands of robbers and dacoits that were haunting these areas and kind of terrorizing his villagers. So he took that thing into control as well. He then started extending the railway so that the annual pilgrimage that the Hindus performed to the shrine of Krishna could be done with ease. Now, all of this development and work was going nice and well until the monsoon season of 1911. Now, previously, the monsoon rains would definitely touch upon Navanagar and provide them with much needed relief from the dry, arid climate. And this was also essential for the crops. But this time, the monsoon rains were nowhere to be seen. And the drought and famine that followed was so intense that Ranji had to stop all of its projects and had to pour all of his money towards making sure that his population doesn't starve. Along with this, he also had to apply for a loan from the government to make sure that the people could survive. Unfortunately, the same year coincided with this event, which was the Delhi Darbar. Rulers from all over India were to attend it, and Ranji decided that his entertaining and his entourage should be nothing less than other Maharajas whose states were actually much more wealthy. So it's said that he rode to the Darbar in a silver coach, and when he got off the carriage, he was adorned with jewels and expensive clothes, and then he spent a lot of money entertaining people, and all of this actually backfired. This is the mistake I was talking about earlier that Ranji made, because he had always enjoyed having an extravagant lifestyle and he had always had money problems, and sadly those problems followed him even when he became a ruler. But a lot of people around him actually noted this and thought that he wasn't quite serious or he didn't really know how to administer his state, including the British, who now recommended that Ranji hire a financial advisor because he clearly cannot take care of the finances of his empire himself. Ranji was very hurt by this, and he wrote, "Injustice is felt as keenly by princes as by peasants." People also started giving him unsolicited advice, and they were like, why don't you first build up opportunities for revenue and then use that revenue to build up your state rather than getting loans and such? What those people didn't realize was that with the drought and the famine, all avenues of revenue had been severely wiped out. One of the projects that Ranji had started in the very beginning of his time were pearl fisheries, and it was exactly those that came in handy at this point in time, because finally they had started production and they were bringing in profits much greater than what was anticipated. So some of his problems kind of started to get solved because of them. But make no mistake, the state still had money problems. Now, following this, Ranji made another trip to England. He actually kept going back and forth between England and India over and over. And after this trip, when he came back to India, the First World War actually broke out. And when the British Empire asked for their help and support, all of these Indian princes, especially Ranji, they were all ready to help, and help they did. Not only did Ranji provide support in terms of money, but also in terms of manpower. He himself also left his state in the hands of his financial advisor and went to fight for the allies on the war front. The Maharajas and the kings were basically kept away from the actual battlegrounds, but they were still quite close to the fighting. Now, during that time, Ranji actually took courses in how to use a machine gun. He was also learning how to fly. This guy wanted to do everything. I heavily relate with him in that matter. Now, during this time that he was in England for the war effort, a firing accident among his own battalion kind of also caused him the loss of his right eye. And this was a loss that would not only hinder him in life, but also when he played cricket later on, because his ability to judge the ball and the distance and all of that was greatly affected. During this time, his asthma and his bronchitis also flared up and he got quite ill. Now, Ranji's friend and financial advisor, Brathan, in whose hands he'd left the state of Navanagar, was basically sending Ranji letters stating alarming numbers and alarming demands. Because even though, as I mentioned, Ranji had offered so much more help than his state could afford, the British thought that it was not enough. They wanted more. And they wanted more out of all the Maharajas. The Britishers were basically shrugging away everything that they had already done so far. So this was something that kind of hurt all these Maharajas. Now at the same time, Ranji's sister was also about to get married. So Ranji went back to India once more. But in his letters and his writings, he talks about how he actually loved the war front. He really wanted to fight some more. Now since we're on the subject and we're talking about weddings, what about Ranji? Because in all of the videos I've made about him, there's nothing about his love life, right? But, well, in India, there were virtually no prospects of him getting married, and he never even showed the inclination. Officially, he was always single. But when he was in England, he did have a long-term relationship with this girl called Edith Borisov. But according to the cricket writer E.H.D. Sewell, to whom Ranji himself had narrated the story, according to that, Ranji had asked Edith to marry him after her father had passed away. However, at that point, Edith had refused and said that she had fallen in love with somebody else and moved away. But one thing to note was that at this point, Edith was ending their relationship of 18 years. So a lot of people speculate that she was probably just tired of the wait and hence broke off the engagement. And although Ranji basically had no children and then no heirs, he was very close to his nieces and nephews. And that's something that he was very proud of because he would take care of their education and everything as well later on in life. Now coming back to exactly what became of Navanagar after all of this. Right? Ranji was actually able to deliver on most of his promises. He did manage to build a port for Navanagar at Bedi, which brought in a lot of business and a lot of revenue for Navanagar. He also did reconstruct the entire capital of Jamnagar. And there are Europeans who visited the city of Jamnagar before and after, and they're all praises for how beautifully the city had been redone. They talk about how this city is a perfect example of great planning and Indian craftsmanship because Ranji made sure to have all those local Indian crafts integrated into the design and the architecture of the city. And he also took care of the sanitation problem and the sewage issues. So he did manage to get a lot of things done. Now after this, we all know that times were basically all turmoil because after the First World War ended, shortly afterwards the second one began, and between all of that and during all of that in India there was this movement that had begun, which was the movement for democracy and for democratic representation. Now the rest of his days Ranji had spent uniting his fellow princes against this movement of democracy because see, a lot of these princes, they were very heavily influenced by the Britishers, and in their minds, they also kind of thought that they were like the British. Ranji himself, actually, when he was playing cricket, he's very heavily criticized that he didn't do anything for the development of cricket in India. And when asked, he would remark quite bluntly that he himself is an English player. And it's literally the same as now. So Ranji basically spent his days rallying against the democratic movement and the Indian National Congress. So there you go. This was a rundown of what Ranji, the famous cricketer, was like as a ruler. And it's actually quite impressive, all of the things that he was able to achieve. But obviously, if you want to get more research done, there's so much more material available on him. I have provided some links in the description box below. You can check those out. And if you want more, you can always look it up. So that's it for this video. See you guys next time.